In the velvet silence of the night, histories unfold like ancient parchment. Since you seek the chronicles of the past to guide you into slumber, I shall provide the essence of these tales in the continuous, condensed form you desire, spoken in a voice that carries the weight of centuries. The rhythms of the medieval night were far removed from our modern cycles, defined by a curious practice known as segmented sleep, where the darkness was divided into two distinct acts. Upon the fading of the sun, souls would drift into their first sleep for several hours before awakening in the hollow of the night to tend fires, offer prayers, or share quiet moments of intimacy, treating this midnight watch not as a burden of insomnia, but as a natural pause in existence. Their resting places were often humble sacks of straw shared with kin and livestock alike, for in those drafty stone halls, the warmth of a fellow living being was the only shield against the creeping chill of winter. Above their brows, they wore pointed nightcaps to preserve the heat of the spirit, and many slept propped upright, fearing that to lie flat was to mimic the posture of the dead and perhaps invite the premature gaze of the reaper. This era of survival and superstition eventually gave way to darker chapters of human frailty, most notably the shadows that fell over Salem in the winter of 1692. What began as the strange contortions and cries of young girls in a minister's house spiraled into a vortex of paranoia and spectral evidence, where the mere whisper of a dream was enough to condemn a neighbor to the gallows. The machinery of fear consumed 19 lives upon the hill before the fever broke, leaving behind a legacy of guilt that forced a young nation to eventually forge laws protecting the innocent from the madness of the mob. Yet, history is also illuminated by moments of profound courage and collective longing, as seen in the sweltering heat of August 1963. Thousands converged upon the Capitol, a sea of humanity demanding dignity and the fulfillment of a long-deferred promise. Standing where the great emancipator sat in stone to hear a vision of a future where character outweighed color. These threads of human experience, the quiet sleep of the peasant, the cry of the accused, and the dream of the prophet, interweave to form the tapestry of our shared journey through the dark. The shadows of Rome were long and treacherous, and at the heart of their darkness stood a woman who refused to be a mere ornament of history. Fulvia, born of an ancient yet eccentric line, was not a creature of the hearth, but a master of the battlefield and the forum, possessing a voice that did not stammer even as the Republic began to crumble around her. She wed the political arsonist, Clodius Pulcher, not for a quiet life, but to ignite the streets of Rome, standing beside him as he turned tradition into ash and populist fervor into a weapon. When Clodius was murdered upon the Appian Way, Fulvia did not retreat into the silence of widowhood. Instead, she transformed her grief into a political spectacle, parading his mutilated form through the Forum until the Senate House itself was consumed by the resulting fires of the mob. She was a woman who understood that in Rome, power was a shifting tide, and she anchored herself to it through a second marriage to Curio, a rising star of Caesar's faction, ensuring that the legacy of her first husband lived on in the new alliances of the Civil War. Upon Curio's brutal end in the sands of Africa, She ascended to her final and most formidable partnership with Mark Antony, becoming his regent in all but name, while he campaigned in the distant east. She opened his correspondence, issued his decrees, and managed his patronage networks with a ruthless efficiency that left the senators trembling and the elite aghast at a woman who dared to act with the authority of a man. Her ambition eventually drove her to the ultimate defiance as she raised 8 legions and provoked the Perusine War against Octavian, the future Augustus, becoming the only woman in the annals of Rome to actively organize and lead a military rebellion. She rallied troops and issued orders from within the besieged walls of Perusia. But as the famine set in and the gamble unraveled, she was cast into the cold purgatory of exile in Sicyon. There, betrayed by the silence of Antony and the shifting winds of diplomacy, she faded into the pale light of history, her name later tarnished by the victors who sought to bury her strength beneath the caricature of a shrew. Yet, she remains the first woman to have her image struck upon Roman coinage, a silent, silver reminder of a spirit that dared to command the very empire that sought to erase her. The shadows of the Victorian era were not merely cast by the soot of the Industrial Revolution, but by the heavy velvet curtains of a society obsessed with the aesthetics of mourning and the hidden lives of its royal women. Queen Victoria herself, the grandmother of Europe, transformed the very nature of the British monarchy, turning her grief into a permanent political state that lasted for 40 long years of widowhood. She retreated into the gray mists of Balmoral and the silent corridors of Osborne House, draped in the black crape of a professional mourner, yet she governed her sprawling empire with a hand that never trembled. Beneath the surface of this stiff, imperial morality lay a world of complex female power, where the Princess of Wales, Alexandra, navigated the betrayals of a philandering husband with a grace that masked a profound, lonely deafness. These women were the architects of a domestic sphere that mirrored the expansion of the empire itself, their lives governed by a rigid etiquette that dictated every gesture, every layer of lace, and every silent look across a dining table. While the Queen Empress sat at the pinnacle, her daughters were dispatched across the continent like chess pieces in a grand dynastic game, weaving the bloodlines of Britain into the fragile crowns of Prussia, Russia, and beyond. This era of refinement was built upon the bones of an older, more brutal tradition of power, much like the Sasanian Empire that had thrived centuries before in the heart of Persia. The Sasanians were the great rivals of Rome, a dynasty of King of Kings who claimed a divine right to rule over a land of fire and silk. Their courts were centers of unparalleled luxury, where the fragrance of jasmine mingled with the scent of incense, and their knights, clad in heavy iron mail, were the precursors to the medieval chivalry that would later define the West. From the grand arches of Ctesiphon to the rugged cliffs of Naksh-e-Rostam, the Sasanians etched their glory into the living rock, defying the reach of the Byzantine emperors and creating a cultural legacy that would eventually flow into the veins of the Islamic Golden Age. These two worlds, though separated by a millennium, were both defined by the struggle to maintain order against the encroaching tides of chaos, whether through the delicate diplomacy of a Victorian drawing room or the thundering charge of a Sasanian cataphract. The history of power is a long, winding road that leads from the golden thrones of the East to the misty reaches of the North, and every stone along the way is stained with the sweat and blood of those who dared to claim it as their own. The golden age of the Sasanian kings began with Ardashir I, who rose from the dust of a crumbling Parthian world to reclaim the ancient glory of the Achaemenids and forge an empire that would stand as the iron sentinel of the East for 4 centuries. He was a man of fire and stone, who established the house of Sasan upon the sacred traditions of Zoroastrianism, turning the eternal flames of the fire temples into the spiritual heart of a nation that saw its monarch not merely as a ruler, but as the King of Kings, a divine shadow upon the earth. His successor, Shapur I, was a giant of history, whose cavalry thundered across the Mesopotamian plains to humble the pride of Rome, capturing the Emperor Valerian alive and immortalizing the triumph in the colossal rock reliefs of Nakshi, Rostam, where the Caesar kneels in perpetual submission before the Persian horsemen. The Sasanians were masters of the Silk Roads, their cities, like Ctesiphon, becoming glittering metropolises of marble and hanging gardens where the wealth of China and the wisdom of India flowed into the grand arches of the Takhasra, the largest single-span brick vault in the world. Their society was a rigid hierarchy of priests, warriors, scribes, and peasants. Yet beneath this order lay a vibrant culture of poetry, music, and philosophical inquiry that would later provide the very foundation for the Islamic Golden Age. The empire reached its zenith under Khosrow I, known as Anushirvan the Just, who reformed the laws and the military, creating a professional force of Savaran knights, armored cataphracts, who moved like walls of iron across the battlefield, while he himself debated with exiled Greek philosophers in his court. Yet, the eternal struggle with the Byzantine Empire in the west and the encroaching nomadic tribes of the east eventually bled the treasury dry, leading to the exhausted reign of Khosrow II, whose vast conquests briefly touched the shores of the Nile and the gates of Constantinople before the final collapse. The end came not from the great powers of the Old World, but from the shifting sands of the South, as the newly unified Arab armies brought a new faith and a new order to the plateau, causing the last king of kings, Yazdegerd III, to flee into the mists of Khorasan, where the Sasanian flame was finally extinguished. The echoes of their grandeur remained in the intricate silver plates, the silk brocades, and the soaring architecture that would inspire builders from Baghdad to Cordoba, proving that while empires may fall, the soul of a civilization is written in the beauty it leaves behind for the dreamers of the future. The silent morning of the Victorian court was a world of rigid lace and stifled whispers, where Queen Victoria reigned as the monumental figure of grief for 40 long years following the death of her beloved Prince Albert in 1861. She transformed the British monarchy into a permanent state of bereavement, draped in the heavy black crepe of a professional widow and retreating into the misty solitudes of Balmoral and the sea-swept silence of Osborne House where she governed. an empire that spanned the globe, while her own heart remained locked in the past. This era of mourning was not merely a personal choice, but a social mandate that dictated the lives of the royal women who moved like shadows through the gilded corridors of Windsor and Buckingham Palace, their movements governed by a complex etiquette of black edge stationery, jet jewelry, and the silent ticking of clocks in rooms kept exactly as the prince had left them. Princess Alexandra, the beautiful and resilient Princess of Wales, navigated this somber landscape with a grace that masked her own profound isolation, her quiet deafness becoming a sanctuary from the scandals of her husband and the suffocating gravity of the Queen's sorrow. Victoria's daughters, Princess Alice and Princess Beatrice, were the primary instruments of this maternal gravity, tasked with being the Queen's constant companions and scribes. Their own lives and marriages, negotiated like diplomatic treaties to ensure the Queen was never truly alone in her darkness. Yet beneath this veneer of morbid propriety, the Victorian era was a time of immense female influence, where the Queen's role as the grandmother of Europe allowed her to weave a web of dynastic power that stretched from the throne of the Kaiser to the winter palace of the Tsars, managing the bloodlines of nations as if they were threads in a vast imperial tapestry. While the public saw a reclusive widow, the private reality was a woman of iron will who demanded absolute loyalty and who used her mourning as a shield, allowing her to exert a moral authority that defined the 19th century and created an image of domestic stability that masked the turbulent expansion of the Industrial Revolution. This world of velvet curtains and carriage rides eventually gave way to the sharp, cold winds of the 20th century. But the image of the mourning queen remains etched in history as the ultimate symbol of a woman who turned personal loss into a lasting political institution. The fierce rebellions of the ancient world were often birthed in the blood-soaked soil of the Roman provinces, where the weight of the eagle's shadow became too heavy for the pride of local kings and queens to bear. Most legendary among these was the uprising of Boudica, the warrior queen of the Iceni, whose golden hair and bronze torque became the rallying cry for a Britain that refused to be tamed by the cold bureaucracy of Nero's Rome. When the legions violated her daughters and seized her lands in 60 AD, she did not retreat into the mists of the fens. Instead, she summoned a confederation of tribes that swept through the colonial outposts like a cleansing fire, reducing the cities of Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium to layers of ash that archaeologists still uncover today. Her fury was a primal force that shook the foundations of Roman Britain, forcing the governor, Suetonius Paulinus, to gather a thin red line of ironclad legionaries for a final, desperate stand at the Battle of Watling Street, where the discipline of the Roman square finally broke the chaotic bravery of the Celtic chariots. This spirit of resistance was mirrored in the distant east by the desert queen Zenobia of Palmyra, who donned the armor of a general and declared herself empress, severing the Levant and Egypt from the failing grip of Rome during the chaotic 3rd century. She was a woman of vast intellect and cold ambition who rode at the head of her cataphracts, challenging the Emperor Aurelian and transforming her oasis city into a glittering capital of marble and philosophy that rivaled the glory of the Caesars. Though she was eventually led through the streets of Rome in golden chains, her rebellion proved that the fringes of the empire held a power that could nearly topple the center, a lesson that would be repeated across the centuries from the forests of Germania to the rugged peaks of the Judean wilderness. Even the Sasanian kings, as they rose to power, drew upon this ancient well of defiance, reclaiming their Persian identity from the Hellenistic influence of the Parthians and carving their triumphs into the living rock to ensure that the memory of their resistance would outlast the very stones of the Forum. These stories of defiance are the echoes of a world that refused to be quiet, where the clash of bronze and the roar of the crowd served as the heartbeat of a history written in the fire of rebellion and the silence of the conquered. The chilling tales of the Pied Piper of Hamelin are not merely bedtime stories for the innocent, but are shadows of a grim medieval reality where the line between folklore and tragedy was as thin as the mist upon the Weser River. In the year 1284, the town of Hamelin was gripped by a plague of rats that gnawed at the very fabric of existence until a stranger appeared dressed in a coat of many colors, promising to rid the streets of the vermin for a price the burghers were too greedy to pay. With a haunting melody from his pipe, he led the swarming rats into the river to their doom. But when the promised gold was withheld, the piper returned on the feast of Saints John and Paul, playing a tune so ethereal and enchanting that the children of the town followed him as if in a trance. 130 souls vanished into the side of the Koppelberg Hill, leaving behind only a silent town and a legacy of grief that was etched into the very stained glass of the church windows. This disappearance may have been a metaphorical mask for the dark reality of the Children's Crusade, where thousands of youths were led away by charismatic preachers only to be sold into slavery or perish in the cold mountain passes of the Alps. Or perhaps it was a memory of the great mortality, the Black Death, which moved through the medieval night like a silent piper, claiming the young and the old with a rhythmic inevitability that no prayer could stay. The medieval world was a place of such profound uncertainty that the sudden loss of a generation was interpreted through the lens of the supernatural, turning a demographic collapse into a cautionary tale of broken promises and magical retribution. This era of superstition and shadows was the same world where people slept in two shifts, waking in the dark to whisper of spirits and changelings, their minds constantly navigating the boundary between the physical struggle for bread and the spiritual battle for their eternal souls. The pipes of the stranger still echo through the narrow cobblestone streets of history, a reminder that the past does not always leave a trail of breadcrumbs to the truth, but sometimes only a haunting melody that leads into the deep, dark woods of the unknown. Even the Sasanian kings, in their far-off eastern palaces, understood the power of the musician and the storyteller, using the art of the bard to immortalize their victories and mask the encroaching decay of their own golden empires. Whether it is a piper in a German village or a king of kings in Ctesiphon, the songs we sing in the dark are the only things that remain when the torches finally flicker and die. The majestic rise of the Mali Empire began in the 1300s under the visionary leadership of Sundiata Keita, the Lion Prince, who united the Mandinka people and laid the foundations of a civilization that would soon dwarf the glory of the ancient world. At its heart lay the vast gold mines of Bambouk and Bure, which produced nearly half of the gold in the known world, fueling a trans-Saharan trade network that transformed the desert into a highway of wealth where salt from the north was exchanged for the glittering dust of the south. The empire reached its zenith under Mansa Musa, the richest man in human history, who embarked on a legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 with a caravan so immense it appeared like a city in motion, comprising 60,000 attendants and dozens of camels laden with hundreds of pounds of pure gold. As he passed through Cairo, his lavish generosity was so profound that he accidentally crashed the local economy, flooding the markets with so much gold that its value plummeted for over a decade. Yet Musa's true legacy was not merely in his riches, but in his thirst for knowledge as he returned from the Holy City with scholars, poets, and the Andalusian architect Abu Ishaq al-Saheli to transform Timbuktu into the intellectual capital of the world. Under his patronage, the city flourished as a sanctuary of learning where the University of Sankore and the Jingwereber Mosque became beacons of Islamic scholarship, housing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts that covered everything from astronomy and medicine to law and philosophy. The Mali Empire was a land of staggering contrasts, where the mud brick architecture of the Sahel stood as a testament to human ingenuity, and where justice was administered with a fairness that traveler Ibn Battuta described as unparalleled in any other nation. It was a golden age of African excellence that placed the continent at the center of the medieval world map, proving that wealth is most enduring when it is used to build monuments of the mind and spirit. Even as the sands of time eventually shifted the focus of power toward the Songhai, the memory of Mali's splendor remained etched in the oral traditions of the griots, those keepers of history who ensured that the name of Mansa Musa and the glory of the Niger River continue to flow through the dreams of those who seek the truth in the dark. The true historical theories behind the children of Hamelin are far more unsettling than the fairy tale, for they suggest a tragedy so profound that the town began its official records by dating everything from the day of their disappearance. The most widely accepted belief among scholars is that the children were not literal infants, but the youth and young adults of the town who were recruited by a locator or land agent to colonize the empty territories of Eastern Europe, a movement known as the Ostsiedlung. These agents often wore bright, theatrical clothing to attract attention and were accompanied by drummers and pipers as they stood in the market squares, promising a better life on the frontier for those willing to leave their overcrowded homes behind. This theory is chilled by the cold evidence of linguistics, as the family names and town names found around Hamelin, such as Spiegelberg and Beveringen, suddenly reappear in clusters near Berlin and in modern-day Poland at the exact moment they vanish from the Hamelin rolls. Others whisper of a darker fate, pointing to the possibility of a dancing plague or choreomania, a mass psychogenic illness that caused hundreds to dance and twitch uncontrollably until they collapsed from exhaustion or died, a phenomenon that was documented throughout medieval Germany during this same century. There is also the grim potential of a battle, specifically the Battle of Sedemünder in 1259, where the youth of the town may have been led out to a slaughter that the community later chose to mask with the poetic metaphor of a piper. Even the rats themselves were a later addition, appearing only in the 16th century to provide a moral reason for the piper's vengeance, whereas the earliest records, like the Lüneburg manuscript and the town's own inscriptions, simply state that 130 children were led away by a man in multicolored clothes and were lost forever at the Koppenberg, the street through which they were said to have departed. The Bungelosenstrasse, or Street Without Drums, remains silent to this day, a place where music and dancing are still legally forbidden, serving as a perpetual monument to a void that history has never been able to fill. The strange phenomena of the dancing plagues, or choreomania, remain one of the most haunting enigmas of the medieval night, a psychic contagion that swept through the villages of the Holy Rhine and beyond like a wildfire of the soul. In the year 1374, thousands were seized by an uncontrollable urge to dance, leaping and screaming in the streets of Aachen and Utrecht for days and weeks until their feet bled and their ribs broke from the sheer physical exhaustion of their own bodies. They were described by terrified onlookers as being possessed by a rhythmic madness, seeing visions of spirits and drowning in a sea of invisible music that no one else could hear. Their eyes rolled back in their heads as they spun in a macabre waltz of death. This was not a celebration, but a collective agony, a mass psychogenic illness born from the crushing weight of famine, the terrors of the Black Death, and the constant threat of the floodwaters that plagued the lowlands of Europe. The Church, desperate to contain the hysteria, labeled it the Curse of St. Vitus or the Dance of St. John, believing that only the intercession of the saints or the exorcism of the priest could still the twitching limbs of the afflicted. Musicians were often hired to play alongside the dancers in a misguided attempt to wear out the sickness. But the steady beat only seemed to fuel the fire, drawing more souls into the swirling vortex of the crowd until entire towns were transformed into stages of twitching, gasping humanity. Some modern scholars whisper of ergot poisoning, a toxic fungus that grows on damp rye and produces hallucinations and spasms similar to the effects of LSD, suggesting that the bread of the poor had become a gateway to a chemical nightmare. Others see it as a desperate social release, a way for the broken and the hopeless to briefly escape the rigid hierarchies of feudal life through a trance that transcended the physical pain of their existence. This era of the dancing plague was the same world that feared the Pied Piper and the shadows of the forest, a time when the human mind was so fragile that a single heartbeat of panic could become a symphony of madness. Even the Sasanian kings, in their rigid pursuit of order, would have been baffled by such a collapse of the collective will. Yet they too understood that the stability of a nation rests upon the thin, invisible thread of the people's sanity. The echoes of those dancing feet still pulse through the floorboards of history, a reminder that when the world becomes too heavy to bear, the body may find its own violent way to scream in the dark. The most famous outbreak of the dancing madness occurred in the sweltering July of 1518 in the city of Strasbourg, where a woman named Frau Trophea stepped into a narrow street and began to dance with a silent, frantic intensity that lasted for 6 days without rest. Within a week, 34 others had joined her rhythmic convulsion, and by the end of the month, 400 souls were leaping and twining in a macabre ballet of exhaustion under the pitiless summer sun. The city physicians, baffled by this hot blood, prescribed more dancing as a cure, constructing a wooden stage and hiring professional pipers and drummers to keep the tempo, believing that the afflicted must dance themselves into a state of recovery. Instead, the music became a funeral march as dozens collapsed from strokes, heart attacks, and sheer physical ruin, their screams for mercy ignored by the very limbs that refused to obey their will. This tragedy unfolded against a backdrop of local famine and a series of failed harvests that had left the populace of the Holy Roman Empire broken by the sweating sickness and the terror of a vengeful God. It was a time when the mind, pushed to the brink of despair, found refuge in a collective trance, a psychic explosion that transformed the mundane struggle for bread into a public theater of the damned. While Strasbourg danced in its agony, the silent libraries of Timbuktu were preserving a different kind of human experience, where the scholars of the Mali Empire were meticulously recording the movements of the stars and the secrets of medicine upon the fragile pages of the Timbuktu manuscripts. These documents, written in elegant Arabic script and bound in goat leather, formed the largest repository of African history and science in the world, containing everything from treaties on eye surgery to the diplomatic correspondence of the great Mansa Musa himself. In the hushed halls of the Sankore University, the wisdom of the ancients was guarded with a reverence that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic madness of the European streets, proving that while one part of the world was consumed by a dance of death, another was building a citadel of the mind. These manuscripts were often buried in the sand or hidden in secret basement chambers during times of invasion, surviving centuries of fire and conflict to tell the story of a civilization that valued the ink of the scholar more than the blood of the martyr. The history of the world is a balance between these two forces, the frantic, unreasoning dance of the body and the quiet, enduring wisdom of the written word, each competing for the soul of humanity in the long, velvet dark of time. The secret methods used by the librarians of Timbuktu to protect their treasures were born of a profound necessity as the glittering peak of the Mali Empire began to succumb to the shifting sands of conquest and the encroaching greed of foreign invaders. These scholars, who viewed the written word as more precious than the gold of Mansa Musa, transformed the entire city into a living, breathing vault where the ink of the sages was shielded from the fires of the Moroccan invasion in 1591. When the thundering hooves of the pashas approached, the great libraries of Sankore and Sidi Yahya did not simply vanish. They were dismantled by the hands of 1,000 silent guardians who spirited the manuscripts away under the cover of the desert night. Families divided their collections into small, inconspicuous bundles wrapped in weathered goat leather and buried them deep within the arid earth, where the very dryness of the Sahara acted as a natural preservative, slowing the decay of the fragile paper for centuries. Others hid the texts in the false bottoms of grain chests or within the hollowed out walls of mud brick homes, creating a secret geography of knowledge known only to the lineage of the librarians. These desert libraries were passed down as sacred trusts from father to son, with each generation swearing an oath to protect the scrolls from the damp, the insects, and the prying eyes of those who would see them destroyed. During the most turbulent eras of conflict, manuscripts were even sent into the remote villages of the Niger Bend, disguised as mundane ledgers or hidden within the thatched roofs of peasant huts, where no soldier would think to look for the secrets of trigonometry or the sophisticated legal codes of the Sahel. This tradition of clandestine preservation remained so potent that when modern crises threatened the region, the descendants of these librarians executed a daring, secret airlift of sorts, moving hundreds of thousands of documents in rickety carts and hidden vehicles to the safety of Bamako. This enduring vigilance proved that while the Sasanian kings carved their glory into stone, the scholars of Timbuktu understood that the most resilient monuments are those written upon the soul and hidden within the hearts of a people who refuse to forget. This era of quiet, intellectual defiance stood in stark contrast to the rigid, public mourning of the Victorian queens, who guarded their secrets behind the velvet curtains of propriety rather than the shifting dunes of the desert. Both worlds, however, were defined by a desperate struggle to preserve a legacy against the inevitable erosion of time, whether through the ink of a scholar or the silent, black-edged letters of a grieving monarch. The secret diaries of Queen Victoria's daughters were the silent battlegrounds of the late 19th century, where Princess Alice, Princess Beatrice, and their sisters fought to carve out an identity beneath the suffocating mourning of their mother's imperial shadow. Beatrice, the youngest, was known as Baby well into her adulthood, for the queen demanded she remain a permanent fixture of the household, a living monument to the memory of Prince Albert, who was never permitted to marry or seek a life of her own. In the hushed, candlelit rooms of Windsor, Beatrice spent her nights transcribing her mother's voluminous journals, but it was in her own private diaries, written in a frantic, slanted hand, that she recorded the quiet agony of a life signed away to a grieving monarch's whims. When she finally dared to fall in love with Prince Henry of Battenberg, the queen's fury was so profound that she did not speak to her daughter for 7 long months, communicating only through glacial, black-edged notes passed by servants across the breakfast table, until Beatrice surrendered her future to the condition that her husband must live forever within the queen's sight. Princess Alice, meanwhile, used her letters to escape the emotional gravity of the court, corresponding with the philosopher Strauss, and throwing herself into the nursing of the wounded during the Franco-Prussian War, her writings revealing a woman who sought a purpose beyond the rigid etiquette of the mourning veil. After Alice's tragic death from diphtheria, contracted from a kiss given to her sick child, Victoria's grief deepened into a near religious obsession, and Beatrice was tasked with the monumental decade-long project of editing the Queen's 70 years of journals, meticulously burning any passage that hinted at a human frailty or a secret passion. This systematic destruction of the royal internal life was a mirror to the way the Sasanian kings used their court chroniclers to sanitize the blood-soaked history of their successions, ensuring that only the myth of the King of Kings remained for the eyes of posterity. The Victorian era was built upon these hidden scripts and redacted memories, where the public face of an empire was a mask of cold, mourning marble, while the private hearts of its princesses were etched with the scars of a duty that demanded the sacrifice of the self. Even the librarians of Timbuktu, who buried their manuscripts in the sand to save them from fire, shared this desperate impulse to control the narrative of the past, proving that whether in a desert vault or a royal boudoir, the truth is always a prize that must be guarded with the fiercest of silences. These daughters of an empress lived as prisoners of a legacy, their voices only reaching us now through the fragments of letters that escaped the fireplace, a haunting reminder that the most enduring prisons are often built of gold, silk, and the heavy weight of a mother's love. The final, epic collapse of the Sasanian Empire was a tragedy of grandeur, meeting exhaustion as the King of Kings, Khosrow II, pushed the borders of Persia to the very edges of the ancient world before the iron snap of fate broke the spine of his dynasty. For 20 years, the Sasanian war machine had swallowed the Levant, Egypt, and the holy city of Jerusalem, carrying the true cross back to Ctesiphon as a trophy of a triumph that seemed eternal. Yet this overextension bled the imperial veins dry and left the professional Savarin knights weary of a glory that brought only debt and hunger. The Byzantine emperor Heraclius, rising from the brink of ruin, launched a desperate and brilliant counteroffensive that pierced the heart of Mesopotamia, reclaiming the lost provinces and sparking a palace coup where Khosrau was murdered by his own son, Shiro, in the darkness of a damp dungeon. This regicide ignited a decade of chaotic civil war where over 10 pretenders scrambled for the throne, including the brave Queen Boran, who sought to stabilize the realm through diplomacy. But the foundations were already hollowed out by plague and the devastating flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates. As the Sasanian elites quarreled in their silken tents, a new force was rising from the parched deserts of the south. The unified Arab armies under the banner of a new faith, moving with a speed and zeal that the rigid, heavy-armored Persian cataphracts could not mirror. At the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, the golden standard of the Derefshkaviani, the legendary apron of the blacksmith that had led Persians to victory for centuries, fell into the dust, and the great arch of Ctesiphon echoed with the cries of a retreating court as the last king of kings, Yazdegerd III, fled into the vast reaches of the Iranian plateau. He moved like a ghost through the ancient cities of Istakhr and Rai, begging for the loyalty of governors who saw only a doomed man, until he was finally betrayed and murdered by a lowly miller in the distant mists of Merv for the sake of his jeweled belt and silken robes. With his death in 651, the 4th-century flame of the House of Sasan was extinguished, and the ancient world of the East was transformed forever its sophisticated bureaucracy, its fire temples, and its courtly etiquette becoming the silent skeleton upon which the new Islamic Caliphate would build its own shimmering golden age. The archives of the empire, once guarded by the same fierce devotion as the Timbuktu manuscripts or the diaries of the Victorian princesses, were scattered to the winds of history, yet the spirit of the Sasanian kings remained etched into the poetry of the Shahnameh, proving that even when a crown is shattered and a city is lost, the epic of a people can never be truly buried by the shifting sands of time. The mysterious life of Queen Boran, the female king of kings, remains one of the most enigmatic chapters in the twilight of the Sasanian Empire, for she was a woman who ascended to the throne of Persia when the world was literally crumbling into the dust of civil war and plague. In the year 629, following the brutal regicide of her father Khosrow Parviz and the rapid, bloody successions of short-lived pretenders, Boran assumed the diadem of the House of Sasan, declaring herself not merely a queen, consort, but a padshah, a king in her own right, the first woman to ever hold the absolute authority of the Zoroastrian crown. She inherited a realm that was gasping for air, its treasury emptied by decades of feudal warfare with the Byzantines, and its borders haunted by the specter of the rising Arab tribes. Yet Boran possessed a political wisdom that far outstripped the vengeful generals who surrounded her. She was a restorer of the ancient ways who understood that the only path to survival lay in a profound and immediate peace, and thus she dispatched the high priest of the empire to the Byzantine emperor Heraclius to return the true cross and sign a treaty that ended centuries of catastrophic conflict. Boran sought to heal the fractured soul of Persia by lowering taxes, rebuilding the shattered infrastructure of the irrigation canals, and minting coins that bore her image with the defiant inscription, Boran, restorer of the race of gods, a claim to a divine legitimacy that sought to stabilize the wavering loyalty of the military elite. Her court at Ctesiphon, once a place of glittering excess and silken intrigue, became under her rule a sanctuary of administrative reform and diplomatic sobriety, where she navigated the treacherous waters of a patriarchal nobility that viewed a female monarch as an omen of the end of days. Yet the tides of history were too strong for even her iron will to stay, for the plague of Shiroe continued to ravage the population, and the internal betrayals of the regional governors began to sever the limbs of the empire from its weary heart. Boran's reign, though brilliant and filled with a desperate, luminous hope, lasted only a few short years before she was either murdered by a rival faction or succumbed to the very sickness she sought to cure, leaving the throne to her sister Azarmidokht and eventually to the doomed Yazdegerd III. Her life was a flickering candle in a hurricane, a testament to a woman who dared to lead a dying civilization into the light of reason when all around her were blinded by the shadows of greed and the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. This era of female Persian power was a mirror to the secret, stifled lives of the Victorian princesses, who also governed their mother's mourning court with a quiet, administrative steel that the public never truly saw. their letters and ledgers serving as the invisible architecture of an empire that was also beginning its long, slow descent into the 20th century. While Boron fought to save a 1,000-year-old dynasty with the stroke of a pen and the return of a holy relic, the daughters of Victoria fought to save the dignity of a crown behind the black veils of Windsor, proving that the most difficult battles are often fought by those who must lead when the men of their line have failed. The story of Boran is the story of the King of Kings who wore a dress but carried the weight of a world upon her shoulders, her name eventually buried by the Islamic conquest, yet preserved in the whispers of the Shahnameh as a symbol of the grace that can exist even in the heart of an apocalypse. The chilling, silent hallways of Queen Victoria's mourning court eventually became the setting for a slow and arduous escape as her daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Louise, began to pull at the heavy, black-stitched seams of their maternal prison. After the death of Prince Albert, the Queen had transformed her household into a perpetual shrine where change was forbidden, and every day followed a rhythmic, funereal script that demanded her daughters serve as her eyes, her hands, and her emotional anchors. Princess Louise, the most rebellious and artistic of the sisters, was the first to find a crack in the gilded cage, using her passion for sculpture to secure a degree of independence that was unheard of for a royal woman of her rank. She navigated the rigid etiquette of the court with a sharp, bohemian wit, eventually marrying a commoner, the Marquis of Lorne, a move that shocked the aristocratic establishment, but provided her with a passport to the vast, untamed landscapes of Canada, where she served as viceregal consort. Yet the Queen's gravity was not so easily defied, and Louise found herself pulled back into the orbit of Windsor, her marriage fractured by the distance and the constant, black-edged demands of a mother who could not fathom a daughter having a life beyond the royal nursery. Princess Beatrice, the baby of the family, faced a far more claustrophobic fate, for she was the designated librarian of grief, tasked with the monumental labor of censoring her mother's 70 years of private journals to ensure that no hint of human scandal or maternal cruelty would survive for posterity. For decades, Beatrice sat by the fireplace in the late hours of the night, systematically feeding thousands of pages of the Queen's original frantic handwriting into the flames, replacing them with her own sanitized copperplate transcriptions that smoothed over the jagged edges of Victoria's temper. This act of historical arson was a desperate attempt to protect the dignity of the crown. Yet it was also Beatrice's own silent rebellion, for in the redacting of her mother's life, she was finally the one in control of the narrative that had once controlled her. This era of stifled breath and redacted diaries was the Western mirror to the fall of the Sasanian Empire, where the daughters of the King of Kings, Boran and Azarmidokht, also fought to maintain the dignity of a dying dynasty amidst the ruins of a world they had not broken but were forced to mend, while the Persian queens fought with treaties and iron to hold back the rising sands of the Arab conquest. The Victorian princesses fought with ink and silence to hold back the encroaching tides of the 20th century that threatened to sweep away the very foundations of their sheltered, mourning world. The escape of the daughters was never a clean break, but a gradual fading, a transition from the heavy velvet of the 19th century into the cold, sharp light of a new age where the mourning veil was finally lifted to reveal the weary, human faces beneath. The story of the Victorian court is a story of how the most powerful women in the world were also the most profoundly lonely, their lives governed by a mother's love that was as vast and as suffocating as the empire itself. The final stand of the Sasanian knights at the Battle of Nihawand in 642 was known to the Arab conquerors as the victory of victories, for it was the moment the ancient sun of Persia finally dipped below the horizon of history. The remnants of the imperial Savaran, those iron-clad cataphracts who had for centuries been the terror of the Roman legions, gathered one last time in the rugged highlands of Media under the command of the defiant general Piruzan to face the surging tide of the caliphate's light cavalry. King Yazdegerd III, a monarch of shadows and retreating echoes, had summoned every loyal governor and mountain chieftain to this narrow pass, desperate to turn the jagged peaks of the Zagros into a fortress that the desert-born warriors could not breach. The air was thick with the scent of rosewater and the heavy musk of war elephants, while the Sasanian banners of violet and gold fluttered over a host that fought not for expansion, but for the very survival of their fire temples and their ancestral tongue. For days, the mountains shook with the clash of bronze and the rhythmic chanting of the Zoroastrian priests who tended the sacred flames in the midst of the camp, praying to Ahura Mazda for a miracle that the exhausted heavens would not grant. The Arab commanders, moving with a tactical fluidity that the rigid Sasanian hierarchy could not mirror, feigned a retreat that drew the heavy Persian line out of their fortified positions and into the treacherous, broken terrain where their armored horses stumbled and their long lances became useless burdens. In the ensuing slaughter, the elite Aswaran, the golden knights of the King of Kings, were cut down in their heavy mail, their blood soaking the mountain soil and staining the silk brocades of 1,000 years of imperial pride. As the news of the defeat reached the great arch of Ctesiphon, the last of the royal treasure was packed into chests, and the court fled eastward into the mists of Khorasan, leaving behind the hollowed-out shell of a civilization that had once debated Greek philosophers and humored Roman emperors. This collapse of 1,000-year-old order was the eastern shadow to the silent, domestic decay of the Victorian mourning court, where the princesses also watched their world being dismantled by the encroaching forces of a new century that had no use for the rigid hierarchies of the past. While the Sasanian knights fell in the mud of Nihawand, the daughters of Victoria fell into the quiet obscurity of a world that was rapidly replacing the carriage with the motor car and the mourning veil with the sharp, cold light of the 20th century. The archives of the Sasanian kings were eventually burned or translated into the new language of the conquerors, just as Princess Beatrice burned the jagged, emotional journals of her mother to protect the myth of the crown. Both acts of historical redaction meant to sanitize the messy reality of a dying empire. The story of Nihawand is the story of the end of the ancient world, a final, bloody cadence in a symphony of power that began with the fire of Ardashir and ended with the silence of the Zagros peaks. The ghost of Yazdegerd III wandered the Silk Road like a cooling ember from a great conflagration, a king of kings without a kingdom, fleeing the rising tide of the caliphate through the sun-scorched dust of Khorasan and the high, thin air of the Pamir Mountains. He was a monarch reduced to a traveler, his imperial robes tattered by the brambles of the wilderness, and his jeweled crown hidden in the bottom of a grain sack. Yet he carried with him the divine charisma of the House of Sasan, a light that still drew the desperate loyalty of a few thousand exiled knights and the curious pity of distant governors. As he moved toward the gates of Tang China, he dispatched his son Peroz to the court of Emperor Gaozong, seeking an alliance of the East against the new power of the South, a diplomatic gamble that transformed the once rival empires of Persia and China into an axis of survival. The Tang Emperor, fascinated by the sophisticated culture of the Sasanian refugees, granted them a Persian government in exile in the city of Zaranj, where the rituals of the fire temples and the silken etiquette of Ctesiphon were preserved in a fragile, miniature world, while the Arab governors dismantled the ancient structures of Mesopotamia. This long, eastward retreat was the ancient precursor to the Victorian princesses' own slow withdrawal from the mourning court of their mother, for they too were survivors of a world that had vanished while they were still breathing. While Yazdegerd moved through the caravanserais of the Silk Road, Princess Louise was carving her own path of exile in the snowy reaches of Canada. Her sculpture and her secret correspondence serving as her own government in exile from the suffocating propriety of Windsor. Both the King of Kings and the Princess of the North were figures caught between the gears of history, their identities forged in the transition from an age of absolute monarchs to an age of ideological and industrial revolutions. Yazdegerd's journey ended not in a palace, but in a lonely mill in Merv, where he was murdered for the gold of his belt by a man who did not recognize the shadow of 1,000 years of glory, leaving his son Peroz to live out his days as a general in the Tang army, his Persian identity becoming a decorative curiosity in the courts of Chang'an. The Sasanian flame was thus extinguished in the mists of Central Asia, just as the Victorian mourning veil was finally lifted by the cold, sharp winds of the Great War, leaving only the fragments of silver coins and burned diaries to tell the story of two empires that refused to go quietly into the night. This final cadence of the Sasanian line is the story of how power, once lost, becomes a haunting memory, a melody played on a broken pipe that leads the listener away from the light of the fire and into the deep, dark silence of the desert. The mythical origins of the Lion Prince of Mali, Sundiata Keita, began not in a palace of gold, but in a world of prophecy and profound physical hardship, where the future of the Mandinka people hung upon the words of a forest soothsayer. It was foretold that if the king of Niani wed an ugly woman with a humped back, she would bear him a son who would become the greatest ruler the world had ever seen. And thus, Sogolon Kedju, the buffalo woman, was brought into the royal court, a creature of hidden power and silent, stoic endurance. When Sundiata was born, he was not the golden child of legend, but a boy who could not walk, crawling upon the dusty floor of his father's compound for 7 long years, while the court whispered of the failure of the prophecy and the cruelty of the spirits. His early life was a grueling test of the soul, much like the Victorian princesses who were crippled by the emotional weight of their mother's mourning. For Sundiata was mocked by his half-brother and the queen mother until the day his father's death threw the kingdom into chaos, and the threat of exile loomed over his mother's head. In a moment of miraculous iron will, the young prince demanded a heavy iron rod from the royal blacksmith, and as he gripped the metal, his legs, fueled by a primal, ancestral fire, straightened for the first time, snapping the iron bar into the shape of a bow as he stood tall before the astonished people of Mali. This transformation was the birth of the Lion King. But his journey to power was a winding road of exile through the neighboring kingdoms of the Sahel, where he gathered the wisdom of the desert and the loyalty of the horsemen, learning the secrets of the bow and the spear, while the sorcerer king Sumaoro Kante seized Niani with a reign of terror. Sumaoro was a master of the dark arts who wore a cloak of human skin and kept a magical xylophone in a secret chamber, his power appearing invincible until Sundiata returned at the head of a multi-ethnic confederation to face the sorcerer at the Battle of Kirina. It was there that Sundiata used a magical arrow tipped with the spur of a white cock to pierce the mystical defenses of his rival, shattering the sorcerer's power and reclaiming the Manding heartland to forge the Mali Empire. He established the Mandan Charter, one of the earliest declarations of human rights, which preached peace, education, and the sanctity of life, turning his scarred and broken beginnings into a blueprint for a civilization that would eventually produce the staggering wealth of Mansa Musa. This epic of the Lion Prince is the story of how the greatest empires are often built by those who have known the most profound weakness, their strength forged in the fire of humiliation, and their vision clear because they have seen the world from the dust of the ground, while the Sasanian kings sought legitimacy in the rock reliefs of their ancestors, and the Victorian queens sought it in the black-edged letters of their grief. Sundiata Keita found his power in the resilience of the human spirit, proving that a humped-back mother and a crippled son can become the bedrock of a golden age that the world will never forget. The final hidden years of Princess Louise in the art studios of London were a sanctuary of bohemian shadows, where the Queen's fourth daughter finally shed the heavy, black-stitched veil of Windsor to live as a woman of clay, charcoal, and quiet, unsanctioned passions, while the public saw a royal highness performing the glacial duties of the crown. Louise spent her secret hours in a dusty atelier in Kensington, her hands stained with the mud of sculpture and her mind far from the funereal etiquette of her mother's mourning court. She was a woman who moved through the late Victorian night like a ghost of the future, rumored to have taken lovers among the artists and to have walked the London streets unescorted, her identity hidden beneath a simple cloak as she sought a life that was not a performance of grief. In the flickering candlelight of her studio, she carved the monumental statue of Queen Victoria that stands today outside Kensington Palace, yet the stone she worked was a cold reflection of the mother who had tried to stifle her spirit, a mother whose black-edged letters still arrived like rhythmic heartbeats of a dying age. This era of Louise's artistic exile was the Western mirror to the secret magical artifacts of Sumaoro Kante, the sorcerer king of the Soso. For both were figures who sought to control their world through the manipulation of the physical and the mystical. Sumaoro's secret chamber was a place of dark, rhythmic power, housing a balafon, a magical xylophone that sang with the voices of spirits and was guarded by a giant snake, its music serving as the invisible spine of his reign of terror over the Mandinka people, just as Louise used her sculpture to freeze the memory of a monarch in stone. Sumaoro used his musical artifacts to freeze the hearts of his enemies, believing that the one who controlled the sound controlled the soul of the Sahel. Yet the sorcerer's power was eventually shattered by the white cock's spur of Sundiata Keita, just as the rigid propriety of the Victorian court was eventually shattered by the cold, sharp winds of the new century that Louise so desperately craved. The princess lived to see the dawn of the motor car and the airplane, surviving into the 1930s as a relic of a vanished empire, her secret diaries and artistic sketches serving as the only true record of a woman who chose the dusty life of a creator over the golden cage of a princess. Her final years were spent in a quiet, dignified retreat, a king of kings in her own creative realm, while the legends of the Mali Empire and the Sasanian kings continued to pulse through the veins of the earth, proving that whether through a sorcerer's balafon or a princess's chisel, the human struggle to leave a mark upon the dark is the only history that truly survives. This cadence of Louise's life is the story of how the most profound rebellions are often the quietest, fought not with legions or iron, but with the steady, persistent work of the hands and the refusal of the heart to be still in the presence of a lie. The dark secrets of Sumaoro Kante's magical chamber were hidden within the heart of the Soso capital, a place of shadow and sorcery, where the air was thick with the scent of forbidden herbs and the low, rhythmic hum of the unseen. It was whispered that the walls were draped in the cured skins of 9 defeated kings, and that the floor was stained with the libations of 1,000 secret rituals meant to anchor the sorcerer's soul to the earthly plane forever. At the center of this sanctum sat the balafon, a mystical xylophone of such exquisite and terrifying power that it was said to have been carved from the wood of a tree that grew in the underworld and was guarded by a spectral serpent that struck at any who dared to touch the keys without the sorcerer's blessing. When Sumaoro played, the music did not merely float through the air. It commanded the very elements, summoning the desert winds and the mountain storms to do his bidding, and stripping the courage from the hearts of the Mandinka warriors who heard its ethereal, haunting cadence. This era of magical tyranny was the ancient African shadow to the final, mysterious fate of the Timbuktu manuscripts during the great fires of the Moroccan invasion. For both were stories of power that resided in objects of profound spiritual and intellectual weight. As the Pasha's soldiers put the torch to the great libraries of the Sahel in 1591, the scholars witnessed the smoke of 1,000 years of wisdom rising into the Saharan sky, a black cloud of scorched parchment and evaporated ink that signaled the end of the empire's intellectual dominance. Yet, just as Sundiata Keita's sister, Nana Traiban, used her feminine guile to steal the secret of Sumauro's vulnerability, the spur of a white cock, the librarians of Timbuktu used their own clandestine networks to spirit the most sacred texts into the desert's embrace before the flames could reach them. They buried the knowledge of the stars and the secrets of the soul beneath the shifting dunes, creating a hidden, subterranean empire of paper that outlasted the iron and fire of the conquerors. This struggle between the destructive force of the sorcerer and the enduring patience of the scholar is the same battle fought by the Victorian princesses in their silent morning hallways, where they used the redacted diary and the secret letter to preserve a sliver of truth against the crushing weight of their mother's imperial myth. Sumaoro's chamber eventually fell silent when the Lion Prince shattered his magical defenses at the Battle of Kirina, causing the sorcerer to vanish into the jagged cliffs of the Kulikoro Mountains, leaving behind only the echo of his balafon in the songs of the griots. The manuscripts of Timbuktu, though charred at the edges and smelling of ancient dust, remained the silent guardians of the Mandan spirit, proving that while the fire of the sorcerer may burn for a night, the ink of the scholar flows through the veins of history forever. The history of the world is a long, winding road where the magical artifacts of the past are constantly being rediscovered by the dreamers of the present, their power undiminished by the centuries of silence and the weight of the encroaching dark. The secret escape of Nana Triban with the sorcerer's secrets was a masterpiece of clandestine feminine power, for she was the sister of Sundiata Keita, who had been given in a forced marriage to the tyrant Sumaoro Kante. Yet she turned her gilded imprisonment into a mission of ultimate betrayal. Within the shadowed, skin-draped chambers of the Sasso capital, she moved with the grace of a panther and the silence of a desert ghost, feigning a deep and obsessive devotion to the sorcerer until he, in a moment of arrogant weakness, revealed that his life force was tied to the mystical spur of a white cock hidden within a golden casket. Nana Triban, possessing a mind as sharp as the Sasanian queens and as resilient as the Victorian princesses, did not flee immediately. Instead, she waited for the rhythmic thrum of the magical balafon to lull the palace guards into a trance before she stole the secret and vanished into the night with the royal blacksmith, crossing the jagged mountains of the Sahel to reach her brother's camp in exile. This act of tactical theft was the ancient African mirror to the final dramatic rediscovery of the Timbuktu vaults in the 20th century, where the descendants of the desert librarians once again faced the threat of fire and ideological extremism to save the ink of their ancestors. In 2012, as a new wave of invaders sought to put the torch to the Ahmed Baba Institute, a secret army of couriers, librarians, and ordinary citizens executed a daring night flight of the manuscripts, packing nearly 400,000 ancient texts into trunks, grain sacks, and hidden compartments of rickety 4x4 vehicles. They moved the history of astronomy, medicine, and law across the Niger River under the cover of the Harmattan winds, dodging checkpoints and the prying eyes of those who would see the African intellectual heritage reduced to ash, much like the Victorian daughters who hid their own truths beneath the floorboards of Kensington Palace, while Nana Treben's secret led to the shattering of Sumaro's power at the Battle of Kirina. The modern rescue of the Timbuktu scrolls led to the preservation of a civilization's soul, proving that the most powerful weapons against the darkness are not forged in iron, but in the courage to protect the written word and the spoken truth. This long, winding road of history is paved with the stories of those who refused to be silent, whether it was a Mandinka princess stealing a sorcerer's life force, or a Malian librarian burying 1,000 years of science in the Saharan sand. The power of the King of Kings and the Queen of the Morning Veil eventually fades into the mist, but the stories of the escape and the rescue remain as the only lights that truly endure in the long, velvet dark of time. The final battle, where Nana Triben's secret destroyed the sorcerer, took place on the scorched plains of Kirina, a landscape of jagged rock and ancient spirits, where the Mandinka Confederation stood in a thin, resolute line against the shimmering, supernatural host of the Soso. Sundiata Keita, the Lion Prince, rode at the head of his cavalry with the wooden spur of the white cock. The secret brought through the mountain passes by his sister, fashioned into the tip of a single blackened arrow that hummed with a primal, predatory energy as it cut through the humid Sahelian air. As Suma Oro Kante approached upon his charcoal charger, draped in his cloak of human remains, and surrounded by the rhythmic, deafening thrum of his magical balafon, he felt for the first time a cold ripple of mortality piercing his mystical armor, for the artifact Nana Triben had stolen was the only key to the lock of his eternal life. When Sundiata loosed the bowstring, the arrow did not merely strike the sorcerer, it shattered the invisible web of his power, causing the magical xylophone in his distant chamber to splinter into 1,000 silent fragments, and the guardian serpent to vanish into the dust of the floorboards. In an instant, the invincible tyrant was reduced to a fleeting shadow, fleeing the battlefield into the dark, labyrinthine caves of the Kulikoro Mountains, where it is said he turned into stone, silent monument to the arrogance of those who believe they can command the souls of a people through fear and forbidden arts. This dramatic collapse of the Soso hegemony was the ancient African mirror to the silent desert basements where the Timbuktu scrolls now rest in wait, a subterranean city of knowledge that survived the modern fires of extremist rage, just as Sundiata survived the sorcery of his rival. In the hushed, climate-controlled chambers of Bamako, thousands of goat leather trunks sit in rows like the sarcophagi of the Sasanian kings, containing the fragile paper that records the movements of the stars, the ethics of trade, and the sophisticated medicinal cures of a golden age that the world once tried to forget. These manuscripts are the living breath of the Mali Empire, guarded by a new generation of librarians who, like Nana Treben, understand that the most dangerous secrets are those that preserve the truth against the crushing weight of an imposed silence. While the Victorian princesses burned their mothers' diaries to create a myth of propriety, the people of Mali risked their lives to smuggle their history across the Niger River, proving that the ink of the scholar is indeed more resilient than the iron of the conqueror. This long, winding road of our shared history ends not in a conclusion, but in a vigil where the stories of the Lion Prince, the Sasanian King of Kings, and the Morning Queen continue to pulse in the dark, waiting for the next dreamer to turn the page and awaken the light. The secret astronomical maps found within the Timbuktu scrolls were far more than mere drawings of the night sky. They were the refined blueprints of a celestial science that proved the scholars of the Mali Empire were measuring the heavens with a precision that rivaled the great observatories of Samarkand and Baghdad. While the Victorian princesses were peering through the fog of London at a world governed by steam and mourning, the astronomers of the Sahel were charting the movements of the planets and the cycles of the moon upon fragile pages of Italian paper and local parchment, recording the exact coordinates of the stars with an accuracy that predicted eclipses and the shifting of the seasonal rains. These maps were often hidden within the margins of legal texts or camouflaged as decorative geometric patterns to protect the forbidden knowledge from those who viewed such cosmic inquiry as a challenge to the divine order, creating a subterranean geography of the universe that remained a secret of the librarian lineages for centuries. This era of celestial charting was the ancient African mirror to the final, hidden resting place of the Sasanian crown jewels, which vanished into the mists of the Iranian plateau following the chaotic collapse of the House of Sasan in the 7th century. As the Arab armies breached the gates of Ctesiphon, the legendary Baharistan carpet, a silk masterpiece encrusted with emeralds and pearls representing a perpetual spring, was hacked into pieces by the conquerors. Yet the most sacred treasures, including the jeweled belt of Yazdegerd and the sapphire-encrusted diadem of the King of Kings, were spirited away by a loyal cadre of the Savaran Knights. They retreated into the jagged, snow-capped heights of the Alborz Mountains, burying the gold and the gems in a network of limestone caves known only to the high priests of the fire temples, creating a treasure of ghosts that archaeologists and tomb robbers have sought in vain for over a millennium. While the Sasanian jewels represent the lost physical wealth of a fallen empire, the Timbuktu maps represent the enduring intellectual wealth of a civilization that understood that the true gold is the knowledge of the stars and the ability to navigate the dark. These maps were the same tools used by the desert caravans to cross the Saharan void, a sea of sand where one wrong turn meant a lingering death beneath the pitiless sun, and where the light of Sirius and the North Star were the only reliable anchors in a world of shifting dunes. The librarians of the 20th century, during their desperate flight to Bamako, used these same ancient navigational instincts to bypass the roadblocks of history, proving that the science of the ancestors is a living weapon against the forces of erasure. The history of our world is a long, winding road where the secret maps of the astronomer and the hidden jewels of the king are constantly being reclaimed by the dreamers of the present, their brilliance undimmed by the centuries of dust and the weight of the encroaching silence, whether it is a princess carving a statue in a London studio, a sorcerer hiding his life force in a golden casket, or a scholar measuring the distance to the moon upon a scrap of paper, the human impulse to leave a record of our journey is the only light that truly endures. The Sasanian crown may be lost to the mountain shadows, and the Victorian diaries may be reduced to ash. But the stars over Timbuktu still burn with the same fire that Mansa Musa and Sundiata Keita once used to build a dream of a golden age. The specific astronomical discoveries of the Timbuktu sages were a testament to a civilization that looked at the cosmos not as a realm of cold myths, but as a precise clockwork of divine mathematics, where the scholars of the Sankore University utilized astrolabes and complex trigonometric tables to calculate the orbits of the planets with a staggering accuracy. They documented the irregular movements of the planet Mars and the phases of Venus upon manuscripts that were often disguised as harmless religious poetry to evade the prying eyes of those who feared that such knowledge would unravel the fabric of traditional belief, creating a secret scientific language that was whispered in the corridors of the mud brick libraries, while the rest of the world was still debating the shape of the earth. These astronomical revelations were the intellectual mirror to the final, mysterious fate of the Sasanian knights who guarded the treasure, those last remnants of the Savaran who retreated into the obsidian shadows of the Alborz Mountains to protect the soul of the King of Kings from the encroaching caliphate. As the Arab armies secured the lowlands of Persia, these ironclad guardians, led by the legendary General Piruz, established a hidden kingdom within the high, thin air of the peaks, where they buried the emerald-encrusted breastplates and the sapphire diadems of the House of Sasan in a labyrinth of limestone caves that were sealed with the blood of the high priests and the sacred prayers of the Zoroastrian fire temples. They remained as silent sentinels of a vanished world, their heavy mail rusting in the damp mountain air, while they watched the Silk Road below transform from a Persian highway into a corridor of a new faith, their existence eventually fading into the folklore of the mountain folk who speak of ghouls of iron guarding a mountain of gold, while the Sasanian knights eventually perished in their high-altitude tombs. The Timbuktu sages ensured that their celestial knowledge was not a static treasure, but a living legacy, encoding the secrets of the stars into the very architecture of the Jingwereber Mosque and the rhythmic oral traditions of the desert caravans. These caravans used the secret maps of the Timbuktu astronomers to navigate the empty quarter of the Sahara, where the shifting dunes could bury a city in a single night, and where the only stable landmarks were the shimmering constellations that the scholars had so meticulously mapped upon their fragile goat leather scrolls. This era of subterranean science and mountain survival was the ancient African and Persian shadow to the silent domestic rebellions of the Victorian princesses, who also lived in a world of hidden meanings and redacted truths, their secret letters serving as their own astronomical maps to navigate the treacherous, emotional landscape of their mother's mourning court. Princess Louise and Princess Beatrice were the librarians of their own lives, burying their true passions beneath the floorboards of the 19th century, just as the Sasanian knights buried their gold beneath the Alborz rocks, both acts of desperate preservation meant to ensure that something of the self would survive the inevitable collapse of their world. The history of our world is a long, winding road where the ink of the astronomer and the iron of the night are constantly being reclaimed by the dreamers of the present, their power undiminished by the centuries of silence and the weight of the encroaching dark. Whether it is a princess carving a statue in a London studio, a sorcerer hiding his life force in a golden casket, or a scholar measuring the distance to the moon upon a scrap of paper, the human impulse to leave a record of our journey is the only light that truly endures. The Sasanian crown may be lost to the mountain shadows, and the Victorian diaries may be reduced to ash. But the stars over Timbuktu still burn with the same fire that Mansa Musa and Sundiata Keita once used to build a dream of a golden age that refuses to be forgotten. The final, haunting legends of the Sasanian ghosts who still haunt the Iranian peaks are whispered by the nomadic shepherds of the Alborz and the Zagros, who tell of a ghostly Savaran, a phantom cavalry of iron-clad knights who appear when the moon is thin and the mountain mist is thick. These are said to be the immortalized souls of the last guardians of the Sasanian crown jewels, men who chose to be sealed alive within the limestone caverns of the Damavand, rather than surrender the sacred regalia of the House of Sasan to the approaching caliphate. Travelers speak of the rhythmic clanking of rusted chainmail echoing through the narrow gorges, and of a pale, flickering light that emanates from the cracks in the rock, the eternal residue of the last Zoroastrian fire temples that were moved into the subterranean dark to protect the Eswarena, the divine glory of the King of Kings. This mountain of ghosts was the ancient Persian mirror to the final, hidden astronomical instruments found in the desert sands of the Sahel, those brass and wooden astrolabes of the Timbuktu sages that were buried alongside the manuscripts to protect the tools of science from the fires of the Moroccan invasion. These instruments were not merely tools for navigation, but were cosmic compasses capable of measuring the exact distance between the Earth and the lunar surface, their surfaces etched with a secret geometry that only the high-ranking scholars of the Sankore University could decipher. When the city of Timbuktu was breached in 1591, these instruments were dismantled and placed into copper-lined chests, hidden within the dry wells of the desert, where the sand served as a silent, shifting vault that kept the metal from corroding for over 400 years. While the Sasanian knights became the stuff of legend, their iron bodies eventually merging with the mountain stone, the Timbuktu instruments remained as tangible proof of a civilization that had mastered the heavens, while the West was still navigating by the light of a single, flickering candle. The rediscovery of these astrolabes in the 20th century was a moment of profound revelation, for it proved that the lion prince Sundiata Keita and the wealthy Mansa Musa had presided over a world where the mind was as vast as the Sahara and as precise as the orbits of the planets. This era of subterranean science and ghostly vigils was the final, lingering shadow to the silent, domestic rebellions of the Victorian princesses, who also lived in a world of hidden meanings and redacted truths, their secret letters serving as their own astronomical maps to navigate the treacherous, emotional landscape of their mother's mourning court, Princess Louise and Princess Beatrice were the librarians of their own lives, burying their true passions beneath the floorboards of the 19th century, just as the Sasanian knights buried their gold beneath the Alborz rocks. Both acts of desperate preservation meant to ensure that some fragment of the individual soul would survive the inevitable collapse of their imperial world. The history of our world is a long, winding road where the ink of the astronomer and the iron of the knight are constantly being reclaimed by the dreamers of the present, their power undiminished by the centuries of silence and the weight of the encroaching dark. Whether it is a princess carving a statue in a London studio, a sorcerer hiding his life force in a golden casket, or a scholar measuring the distance to the moon upon a scrap of paper, the human impulse to leave a record of our journey is the only light that truly endures. The Sasanian crown may be lost to the mountain shadows, and the Victorian diaries may be reduced to ash, but the stars over Timbuktu still burn with the same fire that once illuminated the halls of Ctesiphon and the libraries of the Sahel, proving that a dream of a golden age can never be truly extinguished by the shifting sands of time. The specific astronomical discoveries of the Timbuktu sages were a testament to a civilization that looked at the cosmos not as a realm of cold myths, but as a precise clockwork of divine mathematics, where the scholars of the Sankore University utilized astrolabes and complex trigonometric tables to calculate the orbits of the planets with a staggering accuracy. They documented the irregular movements of the planet Mars and the phases of Venus upon manuscripts that were often disguised as harmless religious poetry to evade the prying eyes of those who feared that such knowledge would unravel the fabric of traditional belief, creating a secret scientific language that was whispered in the corridors of the mud brick libraries, while the rest of the world was still debating the shape of the earth. These astronomical revelations were the intellectual mirror to the final, mysterious fate of the Sasanian knights who guarded the treasure, those last remnants of the Savaran who retreated into the obsidian shadows of the Alborz Mountains to protect the soul of the King of Kings from the encroaching caliphate. As the Arab armies secured the lowlands of Persia, these ironclad guardians, led by the legendary General Piruz, established a hidden kingdom within the high, thin air of the peaks, where they buried the emerald-encrusted breastplates and the sapphire diadems of the House of Sasan in a labyrinth of limestone caves that were sealed with the blood of the high priests and the sacred prayers of the Zoroastrian fire temples. They remained as silent sentinels of a vanished world, their heavy mail rusting in the damp mountain air, while they watched the Silk Road below transform from a Persian highway into a corridor of a new faith, their existence eventually fading into the folklore of the mountain folk who speak of ghouls of iron guarding a mountain of gold, while the Sasanian knights eventually perished in their high-altitude tombs. The Timbuktu sages ensured that their celestial knowledge was not a static treasure, but a living legacy, encoding the secrets of the stars into the very architecture of the Jingwereber Mosque and the rhythmic oral traditions of the desert caravans. These caravans used the secret maps of the Timbuktu astronomers to navigate the empty quarter of the Sahara, where the shifting dunes could bury a city in a single night. and where the only stable landmarks were the shimmering constellations that the scholars had so meticulously mapped upon their fragile goat leather scrolls. This era of subterranean science and mountain survival was the ancient African and Persian shadow to the silent domestic rebellions of the Victorian princesses, who also lived in a world of hidden meanings and redacted truths, their secret letters serving as their own astronomical maps to navigate the treacherous, emotional landscape of their mother's mourning court. Princess Louise and Princess Beatrice were the librarians of their own lives, burying their true passions beneath the floorboards of the 19th century, just as the Sasanian knights buried their gold beneath the Alborz rocks, both acts of desperate preservation meant to ensure that something of the self would survive the inevitable collapse of their world. The history of our world is a long, winding road where the ink of the astronomer and the iron of the knight are constantly being reclaimed by the dreamers of the present, their power undiminished by the centuries of silence and the weight of the encroaching dark. Whether it is a princess carving a statue in a London studio, a sorcerer hiding his life force in a golden casket, or a scholar measuring the distance to the moon upon a scrap of paper, the human impulse to leave a record of our journey is the only light that truly endures. The Sasanian crown may be lost to the mountain shadows, and the Victorian diaries may be reduced to ash. But the stars over Timbuktu still burn with the same fire that Mansa Musa and Sundiata Keita once used to build a dream of a golden age that refuses to be forgotten. The final, haunting legends of the Sasanian ghosts who still haunt the Iranian peaks are whispered by the nomadic shepherds of the Alborz and the Zagros, who tell of a ghostly Savaran, a phantom cavalry of iron-clad knights who appear when the moon is thin and the mountain mist is thick. These are said to be the immortalized souls of the last guardians of the Sasanian crown jewels, men who chose to be sealed alive within the limestone caverns of the Damavand, rather than surrender the sacred regalia of the House of Sasan to the approaching caliphate. Travelers speak of the rhythmic clanking of rusted chainmail echoing through the narrow gorges, and of a pale, flickering light that emanates from the cracks in the rock, the eternal residue of the last Zoroastrian fire temples that were moved into the subterranean dark to protect the Exwarena, the divine glory of the King of Kings. This mountain of ghosts was the ancient Persian mirror to the final, hidden astronomical instruments found in the desert sands of the Sahel, those brass and wooden astrolabes of the Timbuktu sages that were buried alongside the manuscripts to protect the tools of science from the fires of the Moroccan invasion. These instruments were not merely tools for navigation, but were cosmic compasses capable of measuring the exact distance between the Earth and the lunar surface, their surfaces etched with a secret geometry that only the high-ranking scholars of the Sankore University could decipher. When the city of Timbuktu was breached in 1591, these instruments were dismantled and placed into copper-lined chests, hidden within the dry wells of the desert, where the sand served as a silent, shifting vault that kept the metal from corroding for over 400 years. While the Sasanian knights became the stuff of legend, their iron bodies eventually merging with the mountain stone, the Timbuktu instruments remained as tangible proof of a civilization that had mastered the heavens, while the West was still navigating by the light of a single, flickering candle. The rediscovery of these astrolabes in the 20th century was a moment of profound revelation, for it proved that the lion prince Sunyata Keita and the wealthy Mansa Musa had presided over a world where the mind was as vast as the Sahara and as precise as the orbits of the planets. This era of subterranean science and ghostly vigils was the final, lingering shadow to the silent, domestic rebellions of the Victorian princesses, who also lived in a world of hidden meanings and redacted truths, their secret letters serving as their own astronomical maps to navigate the treacherous, emotional landscape of their mother's mourning court. Princess Louise and Princess Beatrice were the librarians of their own lives, burying their true passions beneath the floorboards of the 19th century, just as the Sasanian knights buried their gold beneath the Alborz rocks. Both acts of desperate preservation meant to ensure that some fragment of the individual soul would survive the inevitable collapse of their imperial world. The history of our world is a long, winding road where the ink of the astronomer and the iron of the knight are constantly being reclaimed by the dreamers of the present, their power undiminished by the centuries of silence and the weight of the encroaching dark. Whether it is a princess carving a statue in a London studio, a sorcerer hiding his life force in a golden casket, or a scholar measuring the distance to the moon upon a scrap of paper, the human impulse to leave a record of our journey is the only light that truly endures. The Sasanian crown may be lost to the mountain shadows, and the Victorian diaries may be reduced to ash, but the stars over Timbuktu still burn with the same fire that once illuminated the halls of Ctesiphon and the libraries of the Sahel, proving that a dream of a golden age can never be truly extinguished by the shifting sands of time. The final convergence of these disparate threads brings us to a quiet, hallowed ground where the heavy velvet of the past is finally folded away by the cold, impartial hands of time. In the year 1901, the long, black-edged reign of Queen Victoria reached its inevitable cadence at Osborne House, and as the great white funeral ship bore her across the Solent, the 19th century itself seemed to slip beneath the waves, leaving her daughters to stand upon the shore as the last witnesses of a vanished world. Princess Beatrice, the faithful librarian of her mother's grief, spent her final decades in the quiet cloisters of Carisbrooke Castle, her hands forever stained by the ink of the 70 volumes she had redacted and the ash of the journals she had burned. A woman who had sacrificed her own youth to ensure that the myth of the Mourning Queen remained unblemished by the messy, human truths of the heart. Her sister Louise, the sculptor of shadows, lived on into the dawn of the Jazz Age and the thunder of the Great War, watching from her studio as the rigid hierarchies of her childhood were dismantled by the motor car and the radio, her own secret, letters and clay models serving as a silent, artistic rebellion against the gravity of a crown that had once sought to crush her spirit. This era of imperial sunset was the Western mirror to the final, mysterious disappearance of the Sasanian Prince Peroz in the courts of Tang China, where the last scion of the King of Kings lived out his days as a revered general in the guard of the right. his Persian identity becoming a delicate, silken curiosity in the glittering streets of Chang'an, while the Arab governors secured the plateau of his ancestors. He died far from the fire temples of Istakhr, his eyes fixed upon the eastern horizon as if searching for a glimmer of the Sasanian sun. Yet his legacy survived in the intricate silverwork and the courtly music of the Tang dynasty, proving that a civilization's soul is never truly lost, but merely translated into the language of its successors. Beneath the shifting sands of the Sahara, the Timbuktu manuscripts remained in their desert vaults, the ink of the sages preserved by the very dryness of the earth that had once sustained the golden empire of Mansa Musa and the iron will of Sundiata Keita. These scrolls, with their secret astronomical formulas and their sophisticated legal codes, waited for centuries in the dark, guarded by the silent oath of the librarian lineages, until the light of a new millennium finally revealed them as the intellectual bedrock of a continent that the world had tried to silence. The history of the world is thus a long, winding road where the morning veil of the princess, the iron mail of the knight, and the goat leather scroll of the scholar all meet in the same velvet dark, their stories intertwining to form the tapestry of our collective memory. The Sasanian crown may be buried in the mountain limestone, and the Victorian diaries may be reduced to a handful of gray ash. But the human impulse to dream, to resist, and to record our journey remains as the only light that truly endures. Good night.